Get out of my seat before I have you dragged off this plane in handcuffs." The words cut through the hushed reverence of the Diamond-class cabin like a blade through silk, causing 50 passengers to freeze mid-conversation and turn their heads toward the source of the commotion. Captain James Crawford stood towering over seat 1. His silver hair perfectly styled despite the chaos of the storm raging outside, his 4 gold stripes catching the warm LED lighting as he pointed a trembling finger at the woman sitting quietly below him. Dr. Amara Johnson didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't even look up from the water glass she was holding with steady hands. She simply adjusted the hood of her charcoal gray sweatshirt, pulled it a little lower over her exhausted eyes, and whispered 3 words that would eventually destroy everything Crawford thought he knew about power privilege and the dangerous game of judging people by their appearance. "You'll regret this." The rain hammered against the fuselage of Celestial Airways Flight 3247. Like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry giant, each drop exploding against the reinforced windows with the fury of a storm that had been building strength over the Atlantic for 3 days. Inside the climate-controlled sanctuary of the Boeing 777-300ER, the atmosphere was usually one of whispered conversations, clinking crystal, and the soft rustle of financial newspapers being turned by manicured hands worth more than most people's annual salaries. This was Celestial Airways' flagship route from JFK International to London Heathrow, the golden corridor of transcontinental travel where Wall Street titans discussed billion-dollar mergers over Dom Perignon, where tech moguls planned the next disruption of entire industries, and where old money inheritors maintained the carefully constructed social hierarchies that had governed first-class cabins since the dawn of commercial aviation. The Diamond-class seats cost $18,000 each, and every passenger who sat in them understood that they were purchasing more than just extra legroom and premium champagne. They were buying membership in an exclusive club where their presence was never questioned and their comfort was never compromised. Dr. Amara Johnson occupied Seat 1A, the most coveted position on the aircraft. The chairman's seat that was typically reserved for the airline's most important VIP passengers or purchased by Fortune 500 CEOs who needed to arrive in London refreshed and ready to negotiate deals that could shift global markets. To anyone walking past her row, Amara looked absolutely nothing like the typical clientele who frequented this rarefied altitude of luxury travel. She wore a pair of slightly faded gray sweatpants that had seen better days, vintage sneakers that were comfortable rather than fashionable, and an oversized hoodie that had been her constant companion during the 72-hour marathon of negotiations that had just concluded in a windowless boardroom 37 floors above the chaos of downtown Manhattan. Her only luggage was a battered leather rucksack that had traveled with her through graduate school, through the early days of building her investment empire, and through countless red-eye flights where she had learned to sleep sitting up because there was always another deal to close, another company to acquire, another mountain to move. She was exhausted in the bone-deep way that comes from 3 consecutive days of fighting hostile takeover attempts, navigating regulatory hurdles, and convincing skeptical board members that a 34-year-old black woman from Detroit could successfully manage the acquisition of a struggling airline with 12,000 employees and assets worth over $4 billion. The deal she had just finalized wasn't simply big. It was historic, the kind of transaction that would be studied in business schools for decades and discussed in boardrooms whenever someone mentioned the changing face of corporate leadership in America. What none of the crew members or passengers on Flight 3247 knew was that as of 6 hours ago, when the final signatures were applied to the purchase agreement and the wire transfers were confirmed by 3 different banks, Dr. Amara Johnson owned every seat they were sitting in. She owned the silverware on their tray tables, the fuel in the wings, the engines that would carry them across the Atlantic, and the very aircraft itself. The press release announcing Rose Capital's acquisition of Celestial Airways was scheduled to hit the news wires when the markets opened on Monday morning. But until then, she was just another name on a passenger manifest, a last-minute addition that had raised eyebrows at the gate when her priority booking came through the reservation system. Amara pulled her hood lower over her eyes and closed them for a moment, allowing herself to remember her grandmother's weathered hands as they gripped the handle of an industrial mop the way those same hands had smoothed Amara's hair when she was 7 years old, and crying because kids at school had told her that girls who looked like her would never amount to anything more than cleaning the floors that important people walked on. Her grandmother had died before she could see Amara graduate summa cum laude from Wharton, before she could witness the IPO that made Amara one of the youngest billionaires in the country, and before she could know that those same floors would one day belong to the granddaughter she had raised, to believe that dignity was something you carried inside yourself regardless of how the world chose to see you. The cabin air recycling system hummed quietly in the background, maintaining the perfect temperature and humidity levels that kept Diamond-class passengers comfortable during their journey, but Amara could feel something else in the atmosphere. A tension that had nothing to do with the storm outside, and everything to do with the way certain passengers kept glancing in her direction with expressions that ranged from curious to concerned to openly judgmental. Maya Rodriguez, a 26-year-old flight attendant who had been working for Celestial Airways for 3 years, approached Amara's seat with a silver tray bearing a bottle of Dom Perignon and the nervous smile of someone who understood that her job depended on keeping every passenger happy, even when she wasn't entirely sure what was making them unhappy in the first place. "Champagne, ma'am," Maya asked, her voice carrying the slightest tremor that suggested she was new to working the Diamond-class cabin and still intimidated by the wealth and power that surrounded her at 35,000 feet. Amara opened her eyes and looked up at the young woman whose name tag identified her as Maya, noticing the way her hands were gripping the tray just a little too tightly and the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just water, please," Amara replied, her voice raspy from days of negotiations and presentations. "Sparkling if you have it." "Of course, absolutely," Maya said, relief evident in her voice as she turned toward the galley to fulfill what was probably the simplest request she had received all evening. As Maya disappeared behind the curtain that separated the Diamond-class galley from the passenger seating area, the cockpit door opened with the distinctive electronic chime that always preceded the captain's emergence into the cabin. The atmosphere in the first-class section shifted immediately the way the air changes in the moments before lightning strikes, and Amara felt every conversation around her pause as 50 pairs of eyes turned toward the front of the aircraft, where Captain James Crawford was making his entrance. Captain James Crawford possessed the kind of commanding presence that had been carefully cultivated over 28 years of flying commercial aircraft, a silver mane of hair that looked like it had been styled by the same barber who groomed television news anchors, and a jawline that belonged on the recruiting posters that Celestial Airways used to attract young pilots who dreamed of commanding respect at 35,000 feet above the problems of ordinary mortals. At 57 years old, Crawford was Celestial Airways' most senior captain, the face of their marketing campaigns, and a man who genuinely believed that the golden age of aviation had been the era when pilots were treated like gods, and passengers understood their place in the carefully maintained hierarchy that kept commercial aircraft safely in the sky. His father had been an aircraft mechanic who had worked double shifts for 30 years without ever advancing beyond the hangar floor, and Crawford wore his 4 gold stripes like armor against every insecurity he had ever felt about not being born into the kind of wealth that surrounded him in first-class cabins every time he stepped out of the cockpit. He adjusted his captain's cap with the practiced motion of a man who understood that image was 90% of authority, his eyes scanning the Diamond-class cabin with the critical gaze of someone looking for imperfections that could compromise the carefully manufactured illusion of effortless luxury that kept passengers paying $18,000 for seats they could occupy for less than 8 hours. Crawford's mental checklist was always the same. Napkins properly folded, window shades positioned at the regulation angle, overhead bins closed and latched, and passengers who looked like they belonged in seats that cost more than most people's cars. His gaze glided smoothly over the hedge fund manager in seat 2A, who was already absorbed in the latest issue of the Wall Street Journal, paused to give a respectful nod to the Academy Award-winning actress in seat 1F, who had specifically requested extra privacy during her flight, and then stopped abruptly when he reached seat 1A. His eyebrows furrowed as he processed what he was seeing. A young black woman in casual clothing occupying the chairman's seat, her hood pulled up despite the warm cabin temperature, her attention focused on something outside the rain-streaked window rather than on the luxury that surrounded her. For a moment, Crawford wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him, if perhaps the stress of flying through increasingly severe weather had affected his ability to accurately assess what he was seeing. But when he blinked and looked again, the incongruity remained. Something about the scene felt wrong to him, in a way that activated every prejudice he had spent decades learning to disguise behind professional courtesy and airline-mandated diversity training that he had attended but never truly absorbed. Crawford's worldview was built on the assumption that people who could afford diamond-class seats looked a certain way, dressed according to certain unspoken standards, and carried themselves with the confidence that came from generational wealth or recent success in industries that he respected and understood. The institutional pressure that Crawford felt every time he saw a passenger who didn't match his expectations had been intensified recently by a series of company meetings where senior management had made it clear that Celestial Airways could not afford another discrimination lawsuit like the one they had quietly settled just 3 months earlier. The board of directors had emphasized that passenger satisfaction scores were directly tied to crew performance evaluations, and that complaints from high-value customers could result in immediate disciplinary action for any crew member who failed to maintain the standards that separated Celestial Airways from their budget airline competitors. But those same meetings had also made it clear that certain passengers, particularly those with political connections, government contracts, or family members who served on transportation committees, required special attention and accommodation that sometimes conflicted with the equality-focused training that all crew members received during their annual certification process. Crawford found himself constantly navigating the tension between official company policy that mandated equal treatment for all passengers and unofficial pressure to ensure that VIP travelers never had any reason to complain about their experience. As he continued his visual inspection of the cabin, Crawford noticed that Maya was returning from the galley with a glass of sparkling water on a silver tray, her path taking her directly toward the woman in seat 1, whose presence continued to gnaw at him like an unresolved equation that refused to balance. At the same time, he could see through the aircraft windows that a black sedan with diplomatic plates had just pulled up to the jet bridge, signaling the arrival of Preston Vail, the 28-year-old son of Senator Richard Vail, who chaired the Senate Subcommittee on Aviation Safety and whose phone calls to airline executives were always returned immediately. Preston Vail was currently listed on the standby waiting list for an upgrade to Diamond Class, a situation that had occurred because Celestial Airways had oversold their first-class cabin, and their computerized booking system had automatically upgraded a passenger based on frequent flyer algorithm calculations that Crawford didn't understand, but deeply resented when they resulted in complications that he was expected to resolve without creating negative publicity for the airline. Crawford's calculation was simple. Senator Vail's son belonged in Diamond Class because his family's political influence could affect Celestial Airways' ability to secure lucrative government contracts and favorable regulatory treatment, while the woman in seat 1A represented a booking irregularity that needed to be corrected before it created problems that could reflect poorly on his performance evaluation and his reputation as a captain who maintained proper standards in his cabin. He straightened his uniform jacket, checked that his wings pin was properly positioned, and began walking toward the galley where Maya was preparing to serve the sparkling water that the woman in seat 1A had requested. His heavy footsteps on the plush carpet announced his approach to anyone who was paying attention, and several passengers looked up from their phones and magazines to watch what they instinctively recognized as the beginning of a confrontation that would either be resolved quickly and quietly, or escalate into the kind of scene that would be discussed in airport lounges and corporate boardrooms for months to come. Crawford's mind was already formulating the professional language he would use to address what he had decided was clearly a booking error that needed to be corrected before Senator Vale's son boarded the aircraft and discovered that his reserved seat had been given to someone who obviously didn't belong in the chairman's suite of the most expensive cabin on Celestial Airways' most prestigious route. Crawford intercepted Maya at the galley station, where she was adding a slice of lime to the sparkling water glass. Her movements careful and precise as she arranged the drink on a silver tray that reflected the warm cabin lighting. Her concentration was focused entirely on ensuring that every detail met the exacting standards that Diamond-class passengers expected, but she looked up when she sensed the captain's imposing presence beside her. Maya Crawford said, his voice carrying the low rumble of authority that he had perfected during 3 decades of commanding flight crews and managing passenger complaints. "Who exactly is that woman in seat 1? A." Maya glanced toward Amara's seat, then back at her captain, her expression shifting from concentration to confusion as she tried to understand why the passenger manifest would be a source of concern. "That's Dr. A. Johnson, Captain," she replied, consulting the tablet that displayed the seating chart and passenger information. She was a late addition to the manifest, but her ticket was issued directly by our corporate reservation system. Crawford's frown deepened as he processed this information, his experience telling him that last-minute corporate bookings were often the result of system glitches, executive favors, or frequent flyer program manipulations that could create problems for crew members who failed to verify that passengers actually belonged in the seats they were occupying. "She's sitting in one," Crawford said, his tone carrying an edge that made Maya's shoulders tense unconsciously. "That's the chairman's seat. It's specifically reserved for full-fare Diamond-class passengers or company VIPs whose travel has been approved at the senior management level." Maya's fingers moved across her tablet screen as she pulled up additional passenger information, her eyebrows rising slightly as she reviewed the booking details. "According to our system, Captain, she has priority status designation, which means she was cleared for upgrade, regardless of the original fare class she purchased." "Priority status," Crawford repeated, his voice rising just enough to be audible to passengers in the nearby seats. He looked back toward Amara, taking in the worn sweatshirt, the absence of any visible jewelry that would indicate significant wealth, and the general appearance of exhaustion that he interpreted as evidence of someone who had spent the night in an airport terminal rather than in a luxury hotel suite. "Look at her," Maya Crawford said, lowering his voice but allowing his frustration to color his words. "Does she look like someone who just dropped $18,000 on a transatlantic flight? Does she look like the kind of passenger who belongs in the same cabin as Academy Award winners and Fortune 500 CEOs? Maya shifted uncomfortably, her training in customer service conflicting with her growing awareness that her captain was asking her to make judgments about passengers based on criteria that had nothing to do with the validity of their tickets or their right to occupy the seats they had been assigned. "Captain," she said carefully, "our passenger manifest shows that her booking is legitimate, and company policy requires that we treat all confirmed passengers with equal respect and service, regardless of their appearance or our assumptions about their background." Crawford's jaw tightened as he realized that Maya was essentially reciting the diversity and inclusion training that all Celestial Airways employees received annually, training that he considered an unnecessary complication in situations where common sense and practical experience should guide decision-making. "This isn't about diversity training," Maya Crawford said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when explaining aviation realities to ground personnel who didn't understand the complexities of managing premium cabin service. "This is about maintaining the standards that our highest-paying customers expect when they choose Celestial Airways over our competitors." He gestured toward the window where Preston Vale's sedan was still visible on the tarmac, its diplomatic plates gleaming under the airport's sodium lights. "Senator Vale's son is currently on our standby list because the booking system made an error and oversold our Diamond-class cabin. If I have to explain to a United States senator why his son couldn't get a first-class seat because we gave priority to a passenger who clearly obtained her upgrade through some kind of frequent flyer glitch or airline employee travel program, that conversation is going to reflect very poorly on both of our performance evaluations. Maya looked down at her tablet again, scrolling through additional passenger information that might provide clarity about the situation. Captain, I could contact our customer service department to verify the booking details, or I could ask Dr. Johnson directly if there's been some kind of mistake with her seat assignment. No, Crawford said firmly, straightening his captain's jacket and checking his reflection in the polished surface of the galley equipment. I'll handle this personally. We need to resolve this situation quietly and professionally before Senator Vale's son boards the aircraft and discovers that there's been a problem with the accommodation that was promised to his office. Crawford began walking toward Amara's seat, his expression set in the mask of professional courtesy that he wore when dealing with passengers who he believed were occupying seats above their proper station. Behind him, Maya watched with growing unease as she recognized the familiar pattern of a confrontation that could either be resolved through calm conversation or escalate into the kind of incident that would require incident reports, witness statements, and possibly media attention that could damage both the airline's reputation and her own career prospects. Several passengers in the surrounding seats sensed the approaching tension and looked up from their phones and magazines to observe what was clearly going to be an interaction between the aircraft's highest-ranking crew member and a passenger whose presence in their exclusive cabin had apparently become a source of concern for reasons they couldn't immediately understand, but found compelling enough to watch unfold in real time. Crawford positioned himself directly beside Amara's seat, his shadow falling across her tray table as he adopted the stance that he used when addressing passengers who needed to understand that their cooperation was not optional. His voice, when he spoke, carried the carefully modulated tone of someone who had learned to disguise hostility as professional concern. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Crawford," he said, omitting the usual pleasantries that he offered to passengers whose presence in Diamond Class he considered appropriate. "I need to take a look at your boarding pass to verify some information about your seat assignment." Amara looked up from the window where she had been watching the ground crew load luggage into the cargo hold, her expression calm but alert as she processed the captain's request and the underlying tone that suggested this was not a routine passenger interaction. She had experienced enough subtle and not-so-subtle forms of discrimination throughout her career to recognize the signs of someone who had already decided that she didn't belong wherever she happened to be sitting. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" Amara asked, her voice even and controlled despite the exhaustion that made her want to avoid any kind of confrontation that would delay her ability to sleep during the 8-hour flight ahead of her. "I just need to verify that everything is in order," Crawford replied, extending his hand expectantly while maintaining eye contact in a way that was designed to establish dominance and discourage questions about his authority to make such requests. Amara reached into the front pocket of her sweatshirt and withdrew the thermal paper boarding pass that she had been given at the gate, handing it to Crawford while noting the way his fingers gripped the document as if he expected to find evidence of fraud or forgery in the standard airline formatting and computer-generated barcode. Crawford examined the boarding pass with theatrical intensity, holding it up to the cabin lighting and studying the printed information with the exaggerated attention of someone performing for an audience, rather than conducting a genuine security check. The hedge fund manager in seat 2A had put down his newspaper to watch the interaction, while the actress in seat 1F had lowered her sunglasses to get a better view of what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable situation. As I suspected, Crawford said, handing the boarding pass back to Amara with the kind of reluctant contact that suggested he found the entire transaction distasteful. "This appears to be an operational upgrade that was processed automatically by our computer system when the flight was oversold." "I paid for this seat," Amara said quietly, her voice carrying enough steel to make several nearby passengers lean forward to hear her response. "I specifically requested seat 1A when I made my reservation, and I was charged the full Diamond Class fare." Crawford's expression shifted to one of barely concealed skepticism, his years of experience convincing him that passengers who looked like Amara typically occupied diamond-class seats only when they had been upgraded due to system errors, employee travel benefits, or frequent flyer program complications that resulted in inappropriate seat assignments. "Ma'am, I understand that there may have been some confusion about your booking," Crawford said, his tone taking on the condescending quality that he reserved for passengers who he believed were trying to take advantage of situations beyond their understanding. "However, I have a responsibility to ensure that our premium cabin maintains the standards that our highest-value customers expect when they choose Celestial Airways." "And what standards would those be?" Amara asked her question, carrying enough quiet challenge to make Crawford realize that this conversation was not going to follow the script he had anticipated. Crawford glanced around the cabin, noting that their exchange had attracted the attention of other passengers, who were now watching with the fascination that people reserved for social conflicts that confirmed or challenged their own assumptions about how the world was supposed to work. "We have certain expectations about dress codes, behavioral standards, and the ability of passengers to appreciate and appropriately utilize the luxury amenities that are included with Diamond-class service," Crawford said, choosing his words carefully to avoid explicitly stating the prejudices that were driving his actions while still making his position clear to anyone who was paying attention. "I'm sitting quietly and drinking water," Amara replied, her voice remaining steady despite the anger that was beginning to build behind her exhaustion. "I haven't violated any dress code, and I haven't engaged in any behavior that could be considered disruptive or inappropriate." Crawford realized that Amara was not going to voluntarily move or admit that there had been some kind of mistake with her booking, which meant that he would need to escalate his approach if he wanted to resolve the situation before Preston Vale boarded the aircraft and discovered that his reserved seat was occupied by someone who clearly didn't belong in the chairman's suite of Celestial Airways' most prestigious cabin. At that moment, the aircraft door opened with the distinctive sound of the jet bridge connecting to the fuselage, and Preston Vale stepped into the Diamond-class cabin with the kind of entitled swagger that came from growing up in a family where influence and access were assumed rather than earned. His arrival immediately shifted the dynamic of the confrontation, as Crawford now had a deadline for resolving what he had decided was an unacceptable situation that threatened to embarrass him in front of a passenger whose complaints could reach the highest levels of both corporate management and federal government oversight. Preston Vale swept into the Diamond-class cabin like he owned not just the aircraft, but the entire airport, his perfectly tailored suit and confident stride announcing to everyone present that he was accustomed to having doors opened for him, problems solved before he knew they existed, and preferential treatment that he had never questioned, because he had never lived in a world where it wasn't automatically provided. At 28 years old, Preston had inherited his father's sense of political entitlement without developing any of the diplomatic skills that had made Senator Richard Vale a respected figure in Washington's transportation policy circles. His first action upon entering the cabin was to scan the seating arrangement with the practiced eye of someone who expected immediate accommodation of his preferences, and his expression darkened visibly when he realized that seat 1A was occupied by someone who didn't match his expectations about appropriate Diamond-class passengers. "Excuse me," Captain Preston said, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that came from decades of watching his father command attention from airline executives, federal regulators, and corporate lobbyists who understood the importance of keeping the Vale family satisfied with their travel experiences. Crawford immediately abandoned his conversation with Amara and turned toward Preston with the kind of deferential attention that he reserved for passengers whose displeasure could result in phone calls to senior management and uncomfortable questions about his ability to maintain proper standards in his cabin. "Mr. Vale," Crawford said, his voice warming considerably as he extended his hand toward the senator's son. "Welcome aboard Celestial Airways. I trust your ground transportation was comfortable despite the weather conditions." "Actually, Captain, there seems to be a problem," Preston said, glancing pointedly toward Amara's seat, while maintaining the kind of polite smile that barely concealed his irritation about having to personally address what he clearly considered a service failure that should have been resolved before his arrival. Crawford felt his stomach tighten as he realized that the situation he had been trying to handle discreetly was about to become a public confrontation between two passengers whose competing claims to seat 1A would require him to make a choice that would inevitably result in complaints, incident reports, and possibly the kind of negative publicity that could damage his reputation as a captain who maintained control over his cabin. "I understand your concern, Mr. Vale," Crawford said, lowering his voice in an attempt to keep their conversation private, despite the fact that every passenger in the surrounding seats was now openly watching the exchange with the kind of fascination that people reserved for social dramas that might confirm or challenge their own beliefs about how privilege and justice were supposed to work in practice. Amara remained seated throughout this exchange, her hands folded in her lap as she observed the interaction between Crawford and Preston, with the analytical attention of someone who had spent years studying power dynamics in boardrooms, where billion-dollar decisions were made through subtle negotiations that often had very little to do with the explicit content of the conversations being conducted. She could see that Crawford was calculating the relative costs and benefits of supporting her legitimate claim to seat 1A versus accommodating Preston's expectation that his family's political connections should guarantee him access to whatever amenities he desired, regardless of existing reservations or airline policies that were supposed to apply equally to all passengers. Ma'am Crawford said, turning back toward Amara with an expression that attempted to project reasonable authority while disguising the prejudice that was actually driving his decision-making process. "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and move to an alternative seat so that we can resolve this booking conflict and ensure that all of our passengers receive the level of service they expect from Celestial Airways." "Which alternative seat?" Amara asked, her voice remaining calm despite her growing awareness that she was being subjected to exactly the kind of discrimination that her grandmother had faced during decades of working in service positions, where her dignity was considered less important than the comfort of people who assumed that their social status gave them the right to determine who belonged in their presence. Crawford consulted his tablet, scrolling through the seating chart until he found what he considered an appropriate solution to the problem that wouldn't result in Preston Vale filing a complaint with his father's office or posting negative reviews on social media platforms that could damage Celestial Airways' reputation among government officials and high-value passengers. "We have seat 42B available in our main cabin," Crawford said, using the airline industry's euphemism for economy class while trying to make the reassignment sound like a reasonable accommodation rather than a punitive action designed to enforce social hierarchies that had nothing to do with the validity of Amara's ticket or her right to occupy the seat she had purchased. "You're asking me to move from Diamond class to a middle seat in economy because Senator Vale's son wants my seat?" Amara asked her question, carrying enough edge to make several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably as they realized they were witnessing a confrontation that was about much more than airline seat assignments. "I'm asking you to cooperate with a reasonable solution that will ensure all passengers receive appropriate service," Crawford replied, his voice rising slightly as he realized that Amara was not going to accept his authority without challenging the rationale behind his demands. Preston stepped closer to the conversation, his presence adding psychological pressure to a situation that was already charged with tension about race class and the unspoken assumptions that governed interactions between people who inhabited very different social worlds, despite finding themselves in the same physical space 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. "Look, this is really quite simple," Preston said, his tone carrying the casual condescension of someone who had never been required to justify his expectations about preferential treatment. "There's obviously been some kind of computer error, and I'm sure this lady understands that certain passengers have priority status that requires special accommodation." Amara looked directly at Preston for the first time since he had entered the cabin, her expression revealing nothing about the calculations that were taking place behind her tired eyes, as she weighed her options and considered the potential consequences of different responses to what was clearly an attempt to use social pressure and implied authority to force her to accept discriminatory treatment. She thought about the acquisition documents in her laptop bag, the contracts that gave her legal ownership of every seat on the aircraft, and the power she could exercise with a single phone call to the airline's chief executive officer, who was probably sitting in his office at that very moment, preparing talking points for the press conference that would announce Rose Capital's purchase of Celestial Airways when the markets opened on Monday morning. But she also thought about her grandmother's teachings about dignity, about the importance of standing up for principles even when doing so was inconvenient or uncomfortable, and about the broader implications of accepting discrimination just because fighting it would require effort and potentially create conflict with people who would never face the same kinds of challenges that she had navigated throughout her career in industries where her presence was often questioned, regardless of her qualifications or achievements. Most importantly, she realized that if she revealed her identity now, it would look like she was using her wealth and power to avoid consequences, rather than standing on principle, and it would teach Crawford and Preston nothing about the humanity and dignity of passengers who didn't have billion-dollar corporations to protect them from exactly the kind of treatment she was currently experiencing. "I paid for this seat," Amara said finally, her voice carrying quiet determination that made it clear she had made her decision about how to respond to their demands. "I'm not moving unless you can show me a legitimate reason why my confirmed reservation should be canceled to accommodate someone else's travel preferences." The standoff lasted for 37 seconds that felt like an eternity to everyone watching. The silence broken only by the steady drum of rain against the aircraft windows and the barely audible hum of the cabin's environmental systems working to maintain perfect temperature and air quality for passengers who were now witnessing a confrontation that would force them to confront their own assumptions about justice, privilege, and the invisible social contracts that governed behavior in spaces where extreme wealth and institutional power intersected. Crawford's face flushed red as he realized that his authority was being challenged in front of passengers whose respect for his competence and leadership was essential to maintaining the kind of cabin atmosphere that separated Celestial Airways from budget airlines, where conflicts between crew members and passengers were routine occurrences rather than shocking breaches of the social order. Ma'am Crawford said, his voice taking on the hard edge that he reserved for passengers who refused to accept his judgment about appropriate behavior and seating arrangements. "I am the captain of this aircraft, which means that my decisions regarding passenger safety, security, and cabin management are final and not subject to negotiation or debate." He stepped closer to Amara's seat, using his height and proximity to create psychological pressure that he hoped would convince her to comply with his demands, rather than continue a confrontation that was attracting attention from flight attendants. Ground crew members visible through the windows and passengers who were already reaching for their phones to document what was clearly becoming an incident that might generate social media coverage and news attention. Under Federal Aviation Administration regulations, Crawford continued, his voice rising to ensure that everyone in the Diamond-class cabin could hear his justification for the actions he was about to take. "I have the authority to remove any passenger who I determine to be disruptive, uncooperative, or potentially threatening to the safety and security of other travelers." Captain Maya interrupted, her voice trembling as she approached the confrontation with a fresh glass of sparkling water that Amara had never received due to the escalating conflict. "Perhaps we could contact our customer service department to verify the booking details and find a solution that would satisfy everyone involved." Crawford spun toward Maya with an expression that made her take an involuntary step backward. "This situation is beyond customer service resolution," he said sharply. "This is a command decision based on my assessment of passenger behavior and cabin management requirements." Amara looked around the Diamond-class cabin, taking in the faces of 50 passengers who were watching her with expressions that ranged from sympathy to curiosity to barely concealed agreement with Crawford's assessment that she didn't belong in their exclusive domain. She saw the hedge fund manager in seat 2, A nodding approvingly at Crawford's demonstration of authority, the actress in seat 1F looking uncomfortable but remaining silent, and several other passengers who seemed relieved that someone was finally addressing what they had apparently considered an inappropriate breach of their social boundaries. But she also saw a few faces that reflected genuine concern about what they were witnessing. Passengers who seemed to understand that they were watching something fundamentally wrong unfold in front of them, but who were uncertain about whether they had any responsibility to intervene or speak up when they saw discrimination being disguised as legitimate airline policy enforcement. "You're making a mistake," Captain Amara said softly, her voice carrying a warning that was lost on Crawford but noticed by several passengers who would later remember the quiet certainty in her tone and wonder if they should have paid more attention to the implications of her words. The only mistake Crawford replied, his confidence bolstered by Preston's presence, and his assumption that Amara had no recourse against his authority, was allowing this booking error to progress this far without correction. Amara reached into her sweatshirt pocket and pulled out her phone, her fingers moving across the screen as she composed a text message that would initiate protocols that Crawford couldn't imagine, and consequences that would reshape his understanding of power authority and the dangerous assumptions that had guided his career for nearly 3 decades. "Initiate Protocol 0, she typed, sending the message to David Chen, her chief legal officer, who was probably reviewing acquisition documents in his office overlooking Central Park. "Track Celestial Airways Flight 3247. Document everything. Do not intervene until I give explicit authorization." She stood up slowly, reaching for her worn leather rucksack while maintaining eye contact with Crawford in a way that communicated dignity rather than defeat. "I'll take seat 42B, she said, her voice carrying across the silent cabin. "But remember this moment, Captain Crawford. You're going to wish you had just let me drink my water." Crawford interpreted her words as an empty threat from a passenger who had finally accepted his authority, but several people in the surrounding seats would later recall feeling an inexplicable chill when she spoke as if they had witnessed something significant that they didn't yet understand, but would eventually recognize as the moment when someone with real power decided to teach a lesson about the consequences of judging people by their appearance rather than their character. The walk from seat 1A to seat 42B was approximately 55 meters through 3 distinct cabin classes, but for Amara it felt like a journey through the entire history of discrimination that had shaped her life and the lives of countless others who had been forced to accept lesser treatment, because people in positions of authority had decided they didn't belong in spaces they had earned the right to occupy. As she moved through the business class cabin, passengers looked up from their laptops and magazines to watch her progress, some with expressions of sympathy, but most with the kind of detached curiosity that people reserved for social dramas that confirmed their existing beliefs about hierarchy, order, and the importance of maintaining boundaries between different categories of travelers. The premium economy section was filled with passengers who had paid extra for slightly more legroom and better meal service, and several of them seemed genuinely confused about why someone was being escorted from first class to economy in a way that suggested punishment rather than voluntary seat change. Finally, Amara reached the main cabin where the temperature was noticeably warmer. The seats were significantly smaller, and the overall atmosphere reflected the cost-cutting measures that airlines used to maintain profitability while providing luxury service to passengers who paid premium prices for premium treatment. Seat 42B was exactly as Crawford had described. A middle seat in the last row of the aircraft, positioned between an elderly man eating a tuna sandwich and a young mother trying to calm a crying infant while managing luggage that didn't fit properly in the reduced storage space that economy passengers were expected to accept as adequate for their travel needs. The contrast between Amara's current situation and the luxury she had just been forced to abandon was stark enough to serve as a perfect illustration of the inequality that existed not just within commercial aviation, but throughout American society, where access to comfort, dignity, and respect was directly correlated with wealth, social status, and the ability to project an image that matched other people's expectations about who deserved preferential treatment. Mr. Williams, the elderly gentleman in seat 42. He looked up from his sandwich as Amara squeezed into the narrow middle seat, his weathered face showing genuine concern about the obvious distress of someone who had clearly been subjected to treatment that no passenger should have to endure, regardless of the circumstances that had led to their current seating assignment. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice carrying the gentle kindness of someone who had lived long enough to recognize injustice when he saw it, and who understood that sometimes a simple expression of human decency could provide comfort to people who were experiencing discrimination or mistreatment. "I'm fine, thank you," Amara replied, though her voice carried the strain of someone who was working hard to maintain composure in a situation that would have driven many people to tears or angry outbursts that would have provided Crawford with justification for his actions. She pulled out her laptop and connected to the aircraft's Wi-Fi system, paying the $25 fee that struck her as particularly absurd, given that she now owned the very infrastructure she was being charged to access. Her fingers moved across the keyboard as she logged into Celestial Airways' internal crew management system using the administrative access codes that had been provided to her legal team during the due diligence process that preceded the acquisition. The personnel file for Captain James Crawford appeared on her screen within seconds, displaying 28 years of employment history that included technical flight ratings, performance evaluations, and a section labeled HR Communications that contained 3 formal complaints regarding his interactions with ground personnel, flight attendants, and passengers who had filed grievances about discriminatory treatment or unprofessional behavior. Each complaint had been classified as a personality conflict and resolved through informal counseling sessions that had apparently done nothing to address the underlying attitudes and behaviors that had generated the complaints in the first place. The most recent incident, which had occurred just 14 months earlier, involved a black business traveler who had been questioned about his right to occupy a first-class seat until he provided multiple forms of identification and documentation that white passengers were never asked to present. "They make these seats smaller every year, don't they?" Mr. Williams commented, his elbow accidentally bumping against Amara's arm as he tried to open a bag of pretzels in the confined space that economy passengers were expected to accept as adequate for 8 hours of international travel. "They certainly do," Amara agreed, her attention divided between the conversation and the personnel records that were revealing a pattern of behavior that suggested Crawford's treatment of her was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a broader approach to passenger management that reflected deep-seated biases about who belonged in premium cabins and who could be safely relegated to inferior treatment without consequence. Meanwhile, in the Diamond-class cabin that Amara had been forced to leave Preston Vale was making himself comfortable in seat 1A, with the kind of casual entitlement that came from never having to question his right to occupy any space he desired or to receive any level of service he demanded. His first action was to recline the seat to its fully flat position, transforming it into a bed that cost more per hour than many people earned in a week, while simultaneously putting his feet up on the pristine bulkhead wall in a way that left scuff marks on the white leather that cleaning crews would have to address before the aircraft's next departure. "Hey, you!" Preston called out, snapping his fingers to get Maya's attention in a way that demonstrated his complete lack of respect for service workers, and his assumption that flight attendants existed solely to anticipate and fulfill his desires, regardless of how those demands were communicated. Maya approached his seat with the kind of forced smile that service industry workers develop as a survival mechanism when dealing with customers whose behavior would be considered unacceptable in any other social context, but which had to be tolerated because their spending power gave them license to treat other human beings as extensions of the luxury amenities they had purchased. "Yes, Mr. Vale." Maya asked, her voice maintaining professional courtesy despite the obvious discomfort she felt about the way he had summoned her and the clear lack of respect he was showing for her dignity as a person rather than simply a provider of services. "The champagne," Preston said, holding up a half-empty glass of Krug that had been poured before his arrival. "It's warm. I don't drink warm champagne. Take this away and bring me a fresh bottle and make sure it's actually chilled this time." Maya's training had taught her to accommodate passenger preferences whenever possible, but she also knew that Celestial Airways only loaded 3 bottles of the premium Krug champagne for each flight, and Preston was now demanding that she open a second bottle for his exclusive use, despite the fact that other Diamond-class passengers might also want to enjoy the luxury beverage that was included in their expensive ticket price. "I'm sorry, sir," Maya said, choosing her words carefully to avoid triggering the kind of aggressive response that she had learned to expect from passengers who interpreted any limitation on their demands as unacceptable customer service failures. "We have a limited quantity of the Krug on board, and I want to make sure we can accommodate all of our Diamond-class passengers throughout the flight." Preston looked up from his phone, where he had been scrolling through Instagram posts that documented his lifestyle of parties, expensive restaurants, and political events where his father's influence guaranteed him access to powerful people who tolerated his presence because of his family connections, rather than any personal accomplishments or admirable character traits. "Did I ask you about inventory management?" Preston said, his voice rising just enough to attract attention from nearby passengers, who were beginning to witness the kind of behavior that demonstrated why some people's access to luxury amenities created problems for everyone else in their vicinity. "I asked you for cold champagne, which seems like a pretty basic request for someone sitting in an $18,000 seat. If you run out, figure out how to get more from business class or economy or wherever else you keep alcohol on this plane. That's what you're paid for, isn't it?" Maya felt her chest tighten as she absorbed the casual cruelty in Preston's voice, the way he had reduced her professional skills and 3 years of training to nothing more than his personal alcohol delivery system, completely dismissing her expertise and treating her like a servant whose only value was her ability to anticipate and fulfill his demands regardless of their reasonableness or their impact on other passengers. She had encountered difficult passengers before, wealthy individuals whose money had convinced them that basic human courtesy was optional when dealing with service workers. But Preston's combination of entitlement and aggression was creating a level of tension that made her hands shake as she tried to maintain the composure that was required to keep her job in an industry where customer complaints could end careers regardless of whether those complaints were justified or fair. "I'll see what I can arrange, sir," Maya said, her voice barely steady as she turned toward the galley, where she hoped to find a few moments to collect herself before returning to deal with Preston's escalating demands and the growing certainty that this flight was going to test every professional skill she had developed during her time with Celestial Airways. As Maya retreated toward the galley, Captain Crawford emerged from the cockpit again, his attention immediately drawn to Preston's presence in Seat 1A and his need to ensure that Senator Vale's son was receiving the kind of preferential treatment that would prevent any complaints from reaching the political and corporate networks that could affect Crawford's career prospects and reputation within the airline industry. Mr. Vale Crawford said, approaching Preston's seat with the kind of obsequious attention that he reserved for passengers whose satisfaction was directly connected to his own job security. "I hope you're finding everything to your liking now that we've resolved the seating situation." Preston barely glanced up from his phone, his attention focused on posting a selfie that would document his luxurious travel accommodations for his social media followers, who expected regular updates about his lifestyle and his access to amenities that were beyond the reach of ordinary people. "Actually," Captain Preston said, still looking at his phone screen rather than acknowledging Crawford's presence with the respect that the captain expected from passengers, regardless of their social status or family connections, "your flight attendant is giving me problems about the champagne service. Can you tell her that customer satisfaction should be the priority here?" Crawford didn't ask for details about the nature of the champagne service issues, didn't inquire about whether Preston's requests were reasonable, or whether Maya had explained any legitimate operational constraints that might affect her ability to provide unlimited alcohol service to a passenger who had already consumed several glasses of premium champagne before the aircraft had even left the gate. Instead, Crawford immediately turned toward Maya, who was returning from the galley with a fresh ice bucket and a forced smile that didn't hide her growing anxiety about managing Preston's demands while maintaining the professional standards that were required of all Celestial Airways crew members, regardless of the challenges they faced from difficult passengers. Maya Crawford called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge that he used when he wanted to ensure that his authority was clearly understood by crew members who might be confused about their priorities when serving passengers whose comfort was considered more important than their own dignity or professional expertise. "Mr. Vale is our priority passenger on this flight." Crawford continued, speaking loudly enough to ensure that other Diamond-class passengers could hear his instructions and understand that preferential treatment was being provided to someone whose family connections guaranteed him access to services that might not be available to less influential travelers. Whatever he requests, you provide immediately, without questioning the appropriateness of his demands or explaining operational limitations that might inconvenience him. Is that clear? Maya felt her face flush as she realized that Crawford was publicly undermining her professional judgment and essentially instructing her to ignore the responsible alcohol service training that all flight attendants received as part of their certification requirements training that was designed to prevent situations where intoxicated passengers could become disruptive or dangerous during flight operations. But Captain Maya said, lowering her voice and stepping closer to Crawford, so that Preston wouldn't hear her concerns about the implications of providing unlimited alcohol service to a passenger who was already showing signs of impairment that could escalate into behavior problems that would affect other passengers and potentially compromise flight safety. "He's already consumed a significant amount of alcohol, and company policy requires that we monitor passenger consumption to prevent situations where intoxication might lead to disruptive behavior or safety concerns that could affect other travelers or crew members." Crawford's expression darkened as he realized that Maya was essentially questioning his judgment about passenger management and raising safety concerns that could complicate his efforts to ensure that Preston Vale's travel experience exceeded his expectations and generated positive feedback rather than complaints that could reach his father's office and potentially damage Crawford's reputation within the industry. "Listen to me carefully," Crawford said, gripping Maya's upper arm in a way that was gentle enough to avoid leaving visible marks, but firm enough to communicate his displeasure with her resistance to his instructions. "I've already had one problem passenger on this flight, and I will not tolerate crew members who create additional complications by questioning my decisions about service levels for our most important customers." He pulled her toward the galley where their conversation would be less visible to passengers, but where his words would carry the weight of a direct threat to her employment and her future prospects within an industry where negative performance evaluations could end careers and prevent flight attendants from finding positions with other airlines. "If Preston Vale files a complaint about inadequate service," Crawford continued, his voice low but intense, "that complaint will reflect on both of our performance evaluations, but you're the one who will lose your job, because expendable crew members are easier to replace than senior captains with 28 years of experience and strong relationships with corporate management." Maya nodded, tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes as she understood that she was being forced to choose between following safety protocols and keeping her job, between maintaining her professional integrity and avoiding retaliation from a captain whose authority within the crew hierarchy gave him the power to destroy her career if she continued to resist his instructions. "Yes, Captain," she whispered, her voice carrying the defeat of someone who had learned that principles were luxuries that service workers couldn't afford when their livelihoods depended on satisfying customers, whose behavior would be unacceptable in any other context, but which had to be tolerated because their wealth and connections made them essentially immune to consequences for their actions. As Crawford and Maya concluded their whispered conversation in the galley, the sound of breaking glass suddenly cut through the ambient noise of the cabin, followed immediately by a woman's scream that was sharp enough to penetrate the sound-dampening materials that separated the Diamond-class cabin from the rest of the aircraft, and alert passengers throughout the plane that something was seriously wrong in the premium section, where problems were supposed to be resolved discreetly rather than escalate into incidents that could attract attention and generate negative publicity for the airline. The sound of shattering crystal was followed by Maya's scream, a cry of shock and humiliation that cut through the carefully maintained atmosphere of luxury and privilege like a blade through silk, instantly transforming the Diamond-class cabin from a sanctuary of wealth and comfort into a scene of chaos that would be remembered and discussed by every passenger present for the rest of their lives. Amara looked up from her laptop screen in seat 42B, her instincts immediately alerting her to the fact that someone was in distress, and that the careful balance of power and authority that governed interactions in commercial aircraft cabins had been disrupted in a way that required immediate attention from someone with the courage and capability to intervene when others might prefer to look the other way. The sound had come from the front of the aircraft, from the Diamond-class cabin that she had been forced to leave, and despite the cramped conditions and social barriers that separated economy passengers from the premium sections, Amara felt an overwhelming responsibility to investigate what had happened and to ensure that no one was being harmed while others stood by and watched because they were too intimidated or too comfortable to take action when action was needed. "Excuse me," she said to Mr. Williams, and the young mother beside her standing up despite the illuminated seatbelt sign that technically prohibited passenger movement during the pre-flight preparation period that was supposed to ensure everyone's safety and security before the aircraft left the gate and began its journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Amara moved through the economy cabin with the kind of purposeful stride that attracted attention from passengers who instinctively recognized that they were witnessing someone taking action in a situation where most people would remain in their seats and hope that someone else would address whatever problem had generated the sounds of distress from the front of the aircraft. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat," a flight attendant in the economy section called out. But Amara ignored the instruction as she pushed through the curtain that separated the main cabin from the premium economy section, her focus entirely concentrated on reaching the source of the commotion and determining whether her intervention might be necessary to protect someone who was clearly in distress. She moved through premium economy and business class with increasing urgency, her path taking her past passengers who looked up from their phones and magazines with expressions of concern and curiosity about what was happening in the first-class cabin that had generated enough noise to penetrate the sound barriers that normally kept different sections of the aircraft isolated from each other's problems and conflicts. "Stop right there," a male flight attendant said, stepping into the aisle to block Amara's progress toward the Diamond-class cabin. "Passengers are not allowed in the forward cabin without authorization from the captain or senior cabin crew." Amara looked past him toward the heavy velvet curtain that separated the business class section from the first-class cabin, where she could hear Preston's voice rising in anger, and what sounded like Crawford's attempts to manage a situation that had clearly escalated beyond his ability to control or contain. "Someone is in trouble up there," Amara said, her voice carrying enough authority to make the flight attendant hesitate, as he tried to balance his responsibility to enforce cabin access restrictions with his growing awareness that the situation in Diamond class might require intervention from someone with the courage to challenge whatever was happening behind the curtain. "I need to make sure no one is being hurt," Amara continued, stepping around the flight attendant, who seemed uncertain about whether his job required him to physically restrain a passenger who was clearly motivated by concern for others, rather than any desire to cause problems or create additional complications for the crew. Amara pushed through the curtain into the Diamond-class cabin and immediately saw a scene that confirmed her worst fears about what had prompted Maya's scream and the sound of breaking glass that had alerted her to the crisis that was unfolding in the premium section, while other passengers remained in their seats and hoped that someone else would take responsibility for addressing the obvious injustice and abuse that was taking place. Preston Vale was standing unsteadily beside seat 1, His expensive suit disheveled and his face flushed with the kind of rage that came from alcohol consumption combined with the frustration of someone who was not accustomed to having his demands questioned or his behavior subject to any form of constraint or criticism from people he considered his social inferiors. Maya was backed against the galley wall, her uniform blouse soaked with red wine that had been thrown at her with enough force to leave stains that would serve as visible evidence of the assault she had just endured. Her hands shaking as she tried to process what had happened, and her eyes wide with the shock that comes from being subjected to violence in a workplace where such treatment was supposed to be prevented by policies and procedures that were apparently worthless when wealthy passengers decided that their comfort was more important than the dignity and safety of service workers. The bottle of wine lay shattered on the plush carpet, its contents spreading across the beige fibers, like blood from a fresh wound, creating a crime scene that would require cleaning documentation and incident reports that would reveal the failure of both Crawford and Celestial Airways management to protect their employees from passengers whose wealth and connections had convinced them that they were above the basic standards of decent behavior that governed interactions between civilized human beings. Captain Crawford was standing between Preston and Maya, but his position and body language made it clear that he was protecting the abusive passenger rather than the victimized crew member. His hands raised in a placating gesture toward Preston, while his back was turned toward Maya in a way that communicated his priorities and his willingness to sacrifice employee safety to maintain the satisfaction of a customer whose family connections made him untouchable regardless of his behavior. "Mr. Vale." "Please sit down," Crawford was saying, his voice tight with panic, as he realized that the situation had escalated beyond his ability to manage discreetly, and that he would need to find a way to protect Preston from consequences while somehow explaining to his superiors why a senator's son had been allowed to assault a flight attendant without facing immediate restraint or removal from the aircraft. "She tried to cut me off," Preston slurred, pointing an accusatory finger at Maya while swaying slightly on his feet in a way that demonstrated his level of intoxication and his complete loss of the self-control that might have prevented him from escalating a service dispute into a criminal assault that would have serious legal and professional consequences for everyone involved. "She had the nerve to tell me I'd had enough to drink, like she's some kind of authority figure who gets to make decisions about how I spend my money or what kind of service I receive when I'm sitting in a seat that costs more than she makes in a month." Crawford's face was pale as he tried to process the implications of Preston's admission that he had assaulted Maya because she had attempted to follow responsible alcohol service guidelines that were designed to prevent exactly the kind of dangerous situation that was now unfolding in front of passengers who were documenting everything with their phones and creating evidence that would be impossible to suppress or explain away when the inevitable investigations began. "Nobody's cutting anyone off," Crawford said desperately, his professional survival instincts telling him that he needed to de-escalate the situation immediately, while somehow maintaining Preston's satisfaction and preventing him from filing complaints that could destroy Crawford's career and reputation within the aviation industry. This was just a misunderstanding between crew members and passengers about service procedures, and we'll get everything sorted out once everyone calms down and returns to their seats so we can proceed with our departure preparations. Amara stepped fully into the Diamond-class cabin, her presence immediately changing the dynamic of the confrontation as Preston and Crawford suddenly realized that their attempts to handle the assault discreetly had been compromised by a witness whose intervention could complicate their efforts to minimize the incident and protect Preston from accountability for his actions. "He's intoxicated," Amara said, her voice calm, but carrying enough steel to make both men understand that she was not intimidated by their attempts to project authority or their assumptions about her willingness to remain silent about what she had witnessed. "And he just assaulted your crew member while you stood there and protected him, instead of restraining him and calling for law enforcement assistance to address what is clearly a criminal act that endangers the safety of everyone on this aircraft." Crawford spun around to face Amara with an expression of fury that was intensified by his growing panic about losing control of a situation that threatened to expose his failure to protect his crew and his willingness to enable abusive behavior from passengers whose wealth and connections he considered more important than basic standards of safety and human decency. "You," Crawford snarled, his voice rising to a level that attracted attention from passengers throughout the Diamond-class cabin, who were now openly watching the confrontation unfold with the fascination that people reserved for social dramas that might reveal fundamental truths about power, privilege, and justice in spaces where those concepts were supposed to coexist peacefully. "I specifically ordered you to remain in your assigned seat in the economy section, and your presence in this cabin constitutes a violation of federal aviation regulations regarding passenger movement during crew operations and emergency response procedures." Crawford was improvising his legal justification as he spoke, inventing regulations that didn't exist while hoping that his authority as captain would intimidate Amara into retreating before she could further complicate his efforts to manage the assault incident in a way that would protect both his career and Preston's reputation. "The emergency," Amara replied, stepping closer to Maya to position herself between the traumatized flight attendant and the two men who had demonstrated their willingness to prioritize passenger satisfaction over employee safety, "is that you have an intoxicated passenger who has just committed assault against your crew member, and instead of restraining him and calling for law enforcement assistance, you're offering him protection while threatening to punish the victim and anyone who witnessed his criminal behavior." Preston laughed, the sound carrying the ugly confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions and who assumed that his family's political influence would protect him from accountability even when his behavior crossed clear legal and moral boundaries that should have resulted in immediate arrest and criminal charges. "Who is this?" Preston asked, looking at Amara with bleary eyes that reflected both his intoxication and his complete inability to process the possibility that someone he considered socially inferior might have the courage or authority to challenge his behavior or demand consequences for his actions. "The cleaning lady coming up here to lecture us about appropriate behavior. That's rich, considering she doesn't even belong in this section of the aircraft, and probably snuck up here to steal champagne or take selfies in first-class seats that she could never afford under normal circumstances." Amara felt the familiar burn of rage that came from being subjected to the kind of casual racism and classism that had followed her throughout her career. The automatic assumptions that people made based on her appearance rather than her accomplishments, but she also felt something else. The cold calculation of someone who had spent years learning to channel anger into strategic action that would produce lasting change rather than momentary satisfaction. "Sit down, Mr. Vale." Amara said, her voice dropping to a tone that carried enough quiet authority to make Preston take an involuntary step backward. "Before you commit additional felonies that will be documented by multiple witnesses and recorded by passenger phones that are currently capturing every word you speak." "Felonies." Preston repeated, his alcohol-impaired brain struggling to process the implications of what Amara was saying and the possibility that his actions might have legal consequences that his father's political influence couldn't eliminate or minimize. "Assault against an airline crew member is a federal crime," Amara explained, her voice maintaining the same calm authority while her eyes moved between Preston and Crawford in a way that made both men understand that she knew exactly what she was talking about, and that their assumptions about her knowledge and capabilities had been dangerously incorrect. Interfering with flight crew operations is also a federal crime, and threatening witnesses to assault could be considered obstruction of justice, depending on how prosecutors decide to interpret your behavior and the captain's failure to properly respond to criminal activity occurring under his authority. Crawford felt his chest tighten as he realized that Amara was demonstrating knowledge of aviation law and criminal procedure that suggested she was far more than the displaced economy passenger he had assumed her to be, and that her presence in the Diamond-class cabin might be the beginning of consequences that would extend far beyond his ability to control or contain. Ma'am Crawford said, his voice taking on a more cautious tone as he tried to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his comprehension. I appreciate your concern for crew safety, but this is an internal airline matter that will be handled according to established protocols for managing passenger incidents and ensuring that all parties receive appropriate consideration of their rights and responsibilities. Internal airline matter. Amara repeated, her eyebrows rising as she processed Crawford's attempt to minimize an assault that had occurred in front of multiple witnesses and that should have resulted in immediate law enforcement involvement, rather than corporate damage control efforts designed to protect wealthy passengers from accountability. A passenger just threw a bottle of wine at your crew member hard enough to shatter the glass and soak her uniform, and your response is to treat it as a customer service issue that can be resolved through internal protocols, rather than as a criminal assault that requires immediate intervention from law enforcement officials. The aircraft suddenly shuddered as it encountered turbulence that was severe enough to cause passengers throughout the cabin to grab their armrests and look around with expressions of concern about the weather conditions that were affecting their departure preparations. But the atmospheric disturbance outside the aircraft was nothing compared to the social and professional turbulence that was building inside the Diamond-class cabin. Crawford's instincts as a pilot immediately activated as he felt the aircraft move in ways that suggested challenging weather conditions that would require his attention and expertise to navigate safely. But his position in the cabin rather than the cockpit meant that he was dependent on his first officer to manage the flight operations while he dealt with the passenger crisis that threatened to destroy his reputation and career. First Officer Chen Crawford called out toward the open cockpit door, his voice carrying the kind of urgency that made passengers realize that the turbulence they were experiencing was serious enough to require immediate crew attention, and that their departure might be delayed while weather conditions were evaluated and flight plans were adjusted to ensure passenger safety. "Yes, Captain," came the reply from the cockpit, the voice belonging to David Chen, a 32-year-old pilot who had been flying as Crawford's first officer for 8 months and who had developed considerable respect for the technical skills that Crawford demonstrated in challenging flight conditions, despite growing concerns about his treatment of crew members and passengers who didn't meet his personal standards for appropriate behavior and social status. "How are we handling this turbulence?" Crawford shouted, his need to maintain his image as a competent pilot, conflicting with his desire to continue managing the assault incident in a way that would protect Preston from consequences and preserve his own reputation as a captain who maintained proper order and discipline in his cabin. "I've got it under control," Captain David responded, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had been trained to handle severe weather conditions and who understood that turbulence, while uncomfortable for passengers, was rarely dangerous for aircraft that were properly maintained and operated by competent crew members. Crawford felt a moment of panic as he realized that his first officer was successfully managing challenging flight operations without his presence in the cockpit, which meant that his authority as the senior pilot was less essential than he had always believed, and that his position as the ultimate decision-maker on the aircraft might be more vulnerable to challenge than he had ever imagined. The turbulence subsided as quickly as it had begun, but the tension in the Diamond-class cabin continued to build as Crawford realized that he had lost control of the situation and that his attempts to manage both the assault incident and the passenger confrontation had created a crisis that threatened to expose his failures as a leader and his willingness to compromise passenger safety and crew welfare to maintain the satisfaction of wealthy travelers whose approval he considered essential to his career prospects. "Listen to me very carefully," Crawford said, his voice taking on the desperate edge of someone who knew that his authority was being challenged in ways that could have permanent consequences for his reputation and his future in the aviation industry. "I am the captain of this aircraft, which means that my authority supersedes any concerns you might have about passenger behavior, crew safety, or law enforcement procedures that you believe should be applied to incidents that occur under my command. Crawford stepped closer to Amara, using his height and proximity to create physical intimidation that he hoped would convince her to retreat and allow him to manage the situation according to his own priorities, rather than according to legal and ethical standards that might require him to take actions that would displease Preston and potentially damage his relationship with powerful people whose influence could affect his career. Under the absolute authority that federal aviation regulations grant to aircraft commanders during flight operations, Crawford continued, his voice rising to ensure that every passenger in the Diamond-class cabin could hear his declaration of power and his warning about the consequences of challenging his decisions. I can remove any passenger who threatens the safety, security, or operational efficiency of this aircraft and its crew. Right now, Crawford said, pointing his finger directly at Amara's face in a gesture that was designed to humiliate her and demonstrate to other passengers that his authority was final and not subject to negotiation or appeal your interference with crew operations, your violation of cabin access restrictions, and your attempts to escalate a minor service dispute into a federal law enforcement matter constitute exactly the kind of disruptive behavior that requires immediate removal from this aircraft. Amara looked at the finger pointing at her face, then at Maya, who was still pressed against the galley wall with wine stains covering her uniform and tears streaming down her cheeks. Then at Preston, who was smirking with the satisfaction of someone who believed that his wealth and connections had once again protected him from accountability for behavior that would have resulted in arrest and prosecution if it had been committed by someone without his family's political influence. She realized that Crawford's escalation of the confrontation had reached a point where she could no longer wait for a more appropriate moment to reveal her identity and exercise the authority that came with owning the airline, the aircraft, and every seat that these men were fighting to control through intimidation, threats, and the abuse of official positions that were supposed to protect passengers and crew members rather than enable discrimination and assault. The game was over, and it was time for Crawford and Preston to learn about the real distribution of power on Celestial Airways Flight 3247. "You're going to remove me from the aircraft?" Amara asked, her voice carrying a tone of quiet amusement that made Crawford pause as he tried to understand why someone he was threatening with ejection from the flight would respond with what sounded like confidence rather than fear or submission. "You're going to have me dragged off this plane by law enforcement officers because I witnessed your passenger assault your crew member and demanded that you take appropriate action to protect your employees' safety and uphold federal laws that prohibit violence against airline personnel." Crawford felt a moment of uncertainty as he processed Amara's response and the way she was framing his threatened actions as violations of his duty to protect crew members and enforce laws that were designed to maintain order and safety in commercial aviation. But his desperation to maintain control of the situation pushed him to continue escalating his threats rather than reconsidering his approach. "I don't need to justify my decisions to a passenger who has repeatedly violated crew instructions, interfered with operational procedures, and demonstrated complete disregard for the authority structures that keep commercial aviation safe and efficient," Crawford replied, his voice carrying the self-righteousness of someone who believed that his position gave him the right to make arbitrary decisions without accountability to higher authorities or legal standards that might constrain his actions. Amara reached into her hoodie pocket, her movement slow and deliberate as she maintained eye contact with Crawford and allowed him to continue digging the hole that would eventually bury his career and reputation when the full implications of his behavior became clear to investigators, journalists, and corporate executives who would review the incident and determine the appropriate consequences for everyone involved. "Drop whatever you're reaching for," Crawford screamed, his panic causing him to interpret Amara's measured movement as a potential threat that required immediate response, even though nothing about her behavior suggested violence or danger to anyone present. "Put your hands where I can see them, and get on your knees while I restrain you for removal from this aircraft, and transfer to law enforcement custody for questioning about your disruptive behavior and potential criminal activity." Preston laughed again, the sound carrying his satisfaction with Crawford's demonstration of authority against someone who had dared to challenge his right to assault airline employees without facing consequences that might inconvenience him or damage his reputation among the wealthy and powerful people whose approval he considered essential to maintaining his lifestyle and social status. Amara didn't get on her knees, didn't put her hands up, and didn't show any sign of fear or submission, as she completed the movement that Crawford had interpreted as threatening by withdrawing a small black leather wallet from her pocket and opening it to reveal credentials that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics that had governed the confrontation since the moment Crawford had first approached her seat and demanded that she justify her presence in the Diamond-class cabin. "I'm not dropping anything, Captain Crawford," Amara said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who was about to reveal information that would destroy every assumption that had guided the behavior of everyone involved in the confrontation. She held up the wallet so that both Crawford and Preston could see the titanium card with the Celestial Airways logo embossed in gold, along with a separate identification card that carried a holographic strip and security features that were impossible to counterfeit, and that immediately identified her as someone whose authority superseded that of any crew member or passenger on the aircraft. "My name is Dr. Amara Johnson," she continued, her voice rising slightly so that passengers throughout the Diamond-class cabin could hear the words that would explain everything they had witnessed and provide context for the injustice and discrimination that had unfolded in front of them over the past hour. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Rose Capital Management, and as of 6 hours ago, Rose Capital completed the acquisition of Celestial Airways, which means that I own this aircraft, every seat you're sitting in, and the contracts that govern your employment and your authority to make decisions about passenger treatment and crew safety." The silence that followed Amara's revelation was so complete that the only sounds in the Diamond-class cabin were the hum of the aircraft's environmental systems and the barely audible whisper of Preston's sharp intake of breath as his alcohol-impaired brain struggled to process the implications of what he had just heard, and the possibility that his assumptions about social hierarchy and power distribution had been catastrophically incorrect. Crawford's face cycled through multiple expressions as his mind tried to reject information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about the passenger he had been threatening and humiliating for the past hour. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound as he stared at the identification credentials that Amara was holding steady in front of his eyes, the holographic security features, reflecting the cabin lights in patterns that confirmed their authenticity and legitimacy. "That's impossible," Crawford finally managed to whisper, his voice carrying the desperate hope of someone who needed the reality he was facing to be some kind of elaborate prank or misunderstanding, rather than the career-ending disaster that it appeared to be. "You can't own an airline. You were sitting in economy. You were wearing a hoodie. You don't look like someone who has the kind of money required to purchase a major aviation company." Amara pulled out her phone, which was still connected to the aircraft's Wi-Fi system, and accessed the digital documents that proved her ownership of Celestial Airways and her authority to make decisions about crew assignments, passenger treatment, and the consequences that would follow from the discrimination and assault that had occurred under Crawford's command during what should have been a routine international flight. "Check the passenger manifest," Captain Amara said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had just revealed her true position in the hierarchy that governed everyone present, and who was now prepared to exercise the power that came with owning a multi-billion-dollar corporation and employing 12,000 people whose livelihoods depended on maintaining proper standards of safety, service, and human dignity. Crawford's hands shook as he picked up Maya's tablet from the galley counter where it had been abandoned during the assault incident, his fingers struggling to navigate through the passenger information system, while his brain continued to resist accepting what his eyes were telling him about Amara's credentials and the fundamental shift in authority that her revelation had created. He scrolled through the passenger list until he found seat 42B, where Amara's name appeared exactly as she had stated. But next to her name was a status code that he had never seen before on any passenger manifest during his 28 years of flying commercial aircraft. Status code 01. Crawford read aloud, his voice barely audible as he struggled to comprehend the meaning of the designation that appeared next to Amara's booking information. Chairman and Chief Executive Officer Amara said, providing the translation that confirmed Crawford's worst fears about the identity of the passenger he had been discriminating against and threatening with removal from an aircraft that she actually owned. Rose Capital's acquisition of Celestial Airways was completed this morning, and while the public announcement won't be made until Monday when the markets open, the legal transfer of ownership and control was finalized 6 hours ago with the authorization of the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Transportation. Preston, who had been silent since Amara's revelation, suddenly found his voice as the implications of the situation penetrated his alcohol-impaired consciousness. And he realized that his assault of Maya had occurred in front of the woman who now owned the airline, and who had the authority to ensure that his actions resulted in serious legal and professional consequences that his father's political influence might not be able to mitigate or eliminate. "This is a joke," Preston said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who needed the reality he was facing to be something other than what it appeared to be. "You're telling me that the woman we threw into economy class is actually the owner of the entire airline? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." Amara turned her attention to Preston for the first time since revealing her identity, her expression showing none of the anger or vindictiveness that he might have expected from someone who had been subjected to discriminatory treatment and witnessed criminal assault, but rather the cold calculation of someone who was already planning the systematic consequences that would follow from everything that had occurred during their interaction. "Mr. Vale," Amara said, her voice carrying the tone that she used in boardrooms when delivering ultimatums to executives whose behavior had created problems that required immediate correction. "You are going to be restrained for the remainder of this flight, and upon arrival in London, you will be met by law enforcement officers, who will place you under arrest for assault against airline crew members, a federal crime that carries serious penalties, regardless of your family's political connections." "You can't do this to me," Preston replied, but his voice lacked the confidence that had characterized his behavior throughout the flight as he began to understand that his assumptions about immunity from consequences had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who possessed real authority in the situation he had created. "My father is Senator Richard Vale, chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Aviation Safety. He has oversight authority over airline operations and regulatory compliance. If you try to have me arrested, he'll launch congressional investigations that will destroy your company and your reputation." Amara smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, the expression carrying more menace than warmth as she considered the threats that Preston was making and the political realities that would actually govern his father's response to news that his son had been arrested for assaulting airline employees while intoxicated on a commercial flight. "Mr. Vale," she said, "your father is a smart politician who understands that his career depends on maintaining public support and avoiding scandals that could damage his reputation with voters who expect their elected representatives to uphold law and order rather than protecting wealthy criminals from accountability." She pulled out her phone and showed Preston the screen, which displayed a video recording application that had been running since she had entered the Diamond-class cabin and witnessed the assault against Maya and Crawford's subsequent attempts to protect Preston from consequences rather than ensuring crew safety and law enforcement compliance. "Do you think Senator Vale wants to explain to his constituents and the national media why he intervened to protect his adult son from prosecution for federal crimes that were captured on video by multiple witnesses?" Amara asked. "Or do you think he would prefer to issue a statement about his disappointment in his son's behavior and his support for the criminal justice system that will hold him accountable for assaulting hard-working airline employees who were simply trying to do their jobs professionally and safely?" Preston's face went pale as he realized that his threats about political retaliation had actually strengthened Amara's position rather than intimidating her, and that his father's political survival might actually require distancing himself from his son's criminal behavior, rather than protecting him from the legal consequences that he had assumed would be eliminated through family influence. Meanwhile, Crawford was still staring at the passenger manifest on Maya's tablet, his brain struggling to accept the reality that the woman he had discriminated against, humiliated, and threatened with arrest was actually his employer, and that every decision he had made during their interaction had been witnessed and documented by the person who would ultimately determine whether he retained his position with Celestial Airways or faced termination and industry blacklisting that would end his aviation career permanently. Dr. Johnson Crawford said, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistakes and their potential consequences for both his immediate employment and his long-term prospects in the aviation industry. "I had no idea about your position with the company, and if I had known your identity, the situation would have been handled very differently. I hope you'll consider that this was a misunderstanding based on incomplete information rather than any intentional disrespect or discrimination against you personally." Amara turned back toward Crawford, her expression showing no sympathy for his predicament or willingness to minimize the implications of his behavior, simply because he was now aware of her authority and concerned about the consequences of his actions. "Captain Crawford," she said, "you didn't discriminate against me because you didn't know I owned the airline. You discriminated against me because you made assumptions about who I was based on my appearance, my clothing, and your personal beliefs about who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect in premium airline cabins." She gestured toward Maya, who was still standing against the galley wall with wine stains on her uniform, and shock evident in her expression as she processed everything that had occurred and tried to understand how the power dynamics in the cabin had shifted so dramatically in her favor. More importantly, Amara continued, "You enabled and protected a passenger who committed assault against your crew member, prioritizing his comfort and satisfaction over her safety and well-being in violation of your duty as captain to protect airline employees and enforce federal laws that prohibit violence against aviation personnel. Under the authority that I have as the owner and chief executive officer of Celestial Airways," Amara said, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had made decisions that would not be subject to negotiation or appeal, "I am relieving you of command of this aircraft effective immediately." The walk from the Diamond-class cabin to seat 42B was the longest journey of Captain Crawford's professional life. Every step taking him further away from the authority and respect he had spent 28 years building, and closer to a reckoning with the consequences of decisions that had seemed perfectly reasonable when he thought he was dealing with a displaced economy passenger, rather than the woman who now owned his career and held his future in her hands. Crawford still wore his captain's uniform, the double-breasted blazer, with its gold wings and the 4 stripes on the epaulets that had always served as symbols of his rank and authority within the strict hierarchy that governed commercial aviation. But as he moved past the business class, passengers who watched his descent with expressions ranging from confusion to fascination, he realized that the uniform no longer represented power or competence, but rather the spectacular failure of judgment that had transformed him from a respected senior pilot into a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and abuse of authority. The passengers in business class had witnessed enough of the confrontation to understand that something significant had happened in the Diamond-class cabin, and several of them held up their phones to record Crawford's walk toward the economy section, their cameras capturing what they instinctively recognized as a moment of justice being served to someone who had misused his position and authority in ways that demanded accountability and consequences. Crawford reached the economy section where the temperature was noticeably warmer, and the atmosphere reflected the cost-cutting measures that airlines used to maintain profitability while providing luxury service to passengers who paid premium prices for premium treatment. And he immediately understood that his assignment to seat 42B was not just a change in his physical location, but a symbolic demonstration of how completely the power dynamics had shifted since Amara's revelation of her true identity and authority. "Mr." Williams looked up from his crossword puzzle as Crawford approached row 42, his weathered face showing genuine concern for someone who appeared to be experiencing significant distress. even though he had no understanding of the circumstances that had led to a uniformed pilot being assigned to an economy seat that was clearly inadequate for his physical size and professional dignity. "You all right there, son?" Mr. Williams asked, his voice carrying the gentle kindness that he had shown to Amara when she had been forced to occupy the same seat under very different circumstances. "You look like someone who's had a pretty rough day." Crawford stared at seat 42B, the middle seat that he had assigned to Amara as punishment for what he had considered her inappropriate occupation of the chairman's suite, and realized that his assumption about the discomfort and humiliation associated with economy seating had been entirely accurate. It was simply being applied to him rather than to the passenger he had chosen to discriminate against based on his prejudices and misconceptions about who deserved luxury treatment. "Sit down. Captain Crawford." Amara's voice came over the aircraft's intercom system, her tone calm and professional as she addressed the situation from the flight deck, where she was now consulting with First Officer Chen about the operational changes that would be necessary to complete the flight safely and efficiently under new command structure that reflected the reality of ownership and authority rather than the assumptions that had guided decision-making up to that point. Crawford squeezed into the middle seat, his large frame immediately coming into contact with the armrests and seatbacks that defined the cramped space that economy passengers were expected to accept as adequate for international flights that could last 8 hours or more. His knees pressed against the plastic tray table of the seat in front of him, and he found himself surrounded by passengers whose proximity and personal belongings created a level of physical intimacy that was completely foreign to someone who had spent his career in the isolated comfort of aircraft cockpits and first-class cabin privileges. To his left, Mr. Williams was working on his crossword puzzle while eating a sandwich that filled the air with the smell of tuna fish and reminded Crawford that economy passengers were expected to provide their own meals rather than enjoying the gourmet cuisine that was automatically provided to passengers who could afford premium cabin privileges. To his right, the young mother was still trying to calm her infant while managing luggage and personal items in the limited storage space that was available to passengers who couldn't afford the luxury of additional baggage allowances and priority boarding that made travel comfortable and dignified for people with sufficient financial resources. "Can you hold this for a minute?" the mother asked Crawford, offering him a burp cloth that was damp and warm from recent use by her baby. She had no idea that she was asking a senior airline captain to assist with childcare responsibilities, and she simply saw another passenger who might be willing to help her manage the challenges of traveling with an infant in the confined space and limited amenities that characterized economy air travel. Crawford looked at the burp cloth in his hand, feeling the weight of the responsibility that the young mother had entrusted to him, and recognizing that his current position in the aircraft's social hierarchy was so diminished that other passengers saw him as someone who could be asked to perform menial tasks rather than someone whose professional authority demanded respect and deference. "I am a captain," Crawford whispered more to himself than to the young mother, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone who was struggling to reconcile his sense of professional identity with the reality of his current circumstances and the dramatic shift in his status within the social ecosystem of the aircraft. "That's nice, dear," the woman replied without looking up from her efforts to organize her belongings and manage her crying baby. "If you're a captain, maybe you can figure out why they keep the economy section so hot and uncomfortable while the people up front get perfect temperature control and all the amenities they want." Crawford realized that the woman's casual response to his statement about his rank reflected a fundamental truth that he had never previously understood, that his authority and status meant nothing to people who were experiencing the cost-cutting measures and inferior treatment that airlines imposed on passengers who couldn't afford luxury accommodations, and that his professional identity was irrelevant to travelers who judged him based on his current situation rather than his past accomplishments or official position. Meanwhile, in the Diamond-class cabin that Crawford had been forced to abandon, the atmosphere had been transformed from one of tension and conflict to something approaching normal luxury service as Amara worked with Maya and the other crew members to ensure that the assault incident was properly documented and that the flight could continue safely under the modified command structure that reflected the new realities of ownership and authority. Maya had changed into a clean uniform blouse and was receiving medical attention for the shock and minor injuries she had sustained during Preston's assault, her confidence slowly returning as she realized that she now had the full support of ownership rather than the hostility and intimidation that she had experienced from Crawford when he had prioritized passenger satisfaction over crew safety and legal compliance. Preston remained in his seat with his hands zip-tied behind his back, his earlier bravado replaced by the sober recognition that his actions would have serious consequences that his family's political influence might not be able to eliminate or minimize, particularly given the video evidence that multiple passengers had recorded and the ownership authority that Amara possessed to ensure that justice was pursued rather than suppressed through corporate damage control efforts. First Officer Chen had assumed command of the aircraft with the calm competence that had made Crawford uncomfortable during their previous flights together, and he was now demonstrating the leadership and technical skills that would make him an excellent candidate for promotion to captain once the investigation and restructuring that would inevitably follow from the day's events had been completed. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Crawford found himself looking out the small economy-class window at the ground crew and airport facilities that he had taken for granted during his career as a senior pilot, and he realized that he was seeing the aviation industry from a perspective that would have been impossible when he occupied positions of authority and privilege that insulated him from the experiences of ordinary passengers and working-class employees who kept the industry functioning despite receiving minimal recognition or compensation for their essential contributions. The Boeing 777-300ER lifted off from JFK International Airport, with First Officer Chen demonstrating the smooth, confident technique that had earned him respect among crew members who had watched Crawford's increasingly erratic behavior and authoritarian approach to command decisions, and the successful departure under new leadership provided immediate evidence that the aircraft and its passengers were safer without Crawford's continued involvement in flight operations. During the 8-hour flight to London Heathrow, Amara worked with Maya and other crew members to compile detailed incident reports that documented every aspect of Preston's assault and Crawford's failure to protect his employees, creating a comprehensive record that would support criminal prosecution and civil litigation, while also providing evidence for the operational and cultural changes that would be necessary to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. The legal framework for addressing Preston's criminal behavior was straightforward. Assault against airline crew members was a federal crime that carried mandatory minimum sentences regardless of the perpetrator's family connections or political influence, and the video evidence that passengers had recorded would make prosecution routine rather than complicated by disputes about facts or witness credibility. More complex would be the professional consequences for Crawford, whose discrimination against Amara and failure to protect Maya represented violations of company policy, federal employment law, and aviation safety regulations that would require investigation by multiple agencies and could result in consequences ranging from termination and loss of pilot licensing to criminal charges related to civil rights violations and conspiracy to obstruct justice. As the aircraft crossed the Atlantic Ocean, news of the incident began to spread through social media platforms, where passengers were sharing video clips and personal accounts of what they had witnessed, creating a viral narrative about discrimination, privilege, and justice that would attract attention from journalists, civil rights organizations, and political figures who understood the broader implications of what had occurred during what should have been a routine commercial flight. The hashtag Celestial Airways scandal began trending on Twitter within hours of the first passenger videos being posted, and the coverage quickly expanded beyond aviation industry publications to mainstream news outlets that recognized the story's potential to illustrate larger social issues about racism, class privilege, and corporate accountability in industries that served the public while often reflecting the worst aspects of American inequality and discrimination. By the time Flight 3247 began its descent into London, Heathrow representatives from the Metropolitan Police, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Transportation were coordinating their response to what had become an international incident involving American citizens, federal crimes, and corporate governance issues that would require careful handling to ensure that justice was served while avoiding diplomatic complications between allied nations. Senator Richard Vail's office issued a statement within hours of being contacted by journalists who were investigating the assault allegations against his son, and the senator's response demonstrated exactly the kind of political calculation that Amara had predicted when she had warned Preston about the consequences of expecting family influence to protect him from accountability for criminal behavior. Senator Vail is deeply disappointed to learn about the allegations regarding his son's behavior during a commercial flight, the statement read, and he supports the full investigation and prosecution of any criminal actions that may have occurred, regardless of the identity of the individuals involved. The senator believes that no one is above the law, including members of his own family, and he will not interfere with law enforcement efforts to ensure that justice is served. The statement effectively abandoned Preston to face the consequences of his actions without political protection, demonstrating that even powerful families understood the importance of maintaining distance from criminal behavior that could damage their reputations and political prospects if they were perceived as trying to obstruct justice or protect wealthy individuals from accountability. Crawford's legal situation was more complicated but potentially more serious, as employment discrimination and civil rights violations could result in both criminal prosecution and civil liability that would extend beyond the loss of his job to include financial penalties and possible imprisonment if prosecutors determined that his actions constituted a pattern of discriminatory behavior that violated federal laws protecting passengers from discrimination based on race, gender, or other protected characteristics. The aircraft landed at London Heathrow with the precision that Chen had demonstrated throughout the flight, and the subsequent ground operations proceeded with the efficiency that characterized properly managed airline operations when crew members were focused on safety and passenger service rather than on protecting abusive passengers or enforcing discriminatory policies that reflected personal prejudices rather than legitimate operational requirements. Preston was met at the gate by officers from the Metropolitan Police who had been briefed on the assault allegations and were prepared to execute an arrest warrant that had been issued based on the video evidence and witness statements that had been transmitted to authorities during the flight, demonstrating the international cooperation that was possible when criminal behavior was clearly documented and reported through proper channels. Crawford's removal from the aircraft was less dramatic but equally decisive as representatives from Celestial Airways' London operations were waiting with documentation that would formally suspend his employment pending the completion of investigations by multiple agencies that would determine the full extent of his liability for the discrimination and safety violations that had occurred under his command. Amara emerged from the aircraft with the dignity that had characterized her behavior throughout the incident. Her transformation from displaced economy passenger to revealed corporate owner serving as a powerful demonstration of the dangers of judging people based on appearance rather than character, and her handling of the crisis providing a model for how authority should be exercised to protect vulnerable employees and ensure that justice prevailed over privilege and political influence. 6 months after the incident that would become known throughout the aviation industry as the Celestial Airways discrimination scandal doctor, Amara Johnson stood in the renovated crew briefing room at the airline's corporate headquarters, addressing a group of newly hired flight attendants whose training had been completely redesigned to emphasize dignity, respect, and the protection of both passengers and crew members from discrimination and abuse that had previously been tolerated as acceptable costs of serving wealthy customers. The transformation of Celestial Airways under Amara's ownership had been swift and comprehensive, reflecting her understanding that systematic change required more than policy modifications, and instead demanded fundamental shifts in corporate culture, hiring practices, compensation structures, and the accountability mechanisms that governed how employees treated each other and the passengers they served during what were often stressful and challenging working conditions. The zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and abuse that Amara had implemented applied equally to passengers and crew members, creating an environment where wealthy travelers understood that their money purchased luxury amenities, but not the right to treat service workers as inferior human beings whose dignity was negotiable based on the price of their tickets or their family connections to powerful political figures. Maya Rodriguez had been promoted to Senior Cabin Service Director with a gold pin that identified her as one of the airline's most respected and capable crew members, and her training of new flight attendants emphasized the importance of professional competence, combined with the knowledge that management would support employees who reported discrimination, harassment, or safety violations rather than punishing them for refusing to tolerate unacceptable behavior from passengers or supervisors. Your job is to ensure passenger safety and provide excellent service to everyone who boards our aircraft, Maya told the new flight attendants during their orientation session, her voice carrying the confidence that came from knowing that her employer valued her expertise and would support her professional judgment, even when it conflicted with passenger demands that violated company policy or legal requirements. But your job is never to accept abuse, discrimination, or treatment that compromises your dignity as a human being, regardless of how much money a passenger has paid for their ticket or how many political connections they claim to possess. The salary increases that Amara had implemented for ground staff and cabin crew reflected her understanding that employee satisfaction and retention were directly connected to the quality of service that passengers received, and that cost-cutting measures that reduced compensation for frontline workers inevitably resulted in higher turnover, lower morale, and inferior customer experiences that damaged the airline's reputation and profitability over the long term. Captain David Chen had been promoted to chief pilot for fleet operations, making him one of the youngest senior officers in the company's history, and reflecting Amara's commitment to advancing employees based on competence, character, and leadership ability, rather than seniority alone or personal relationships with management officials who had previously made promotion decisions based on criteria that had little to do with professional qualifications. Under Chen's leadership, the airline's pilot training program had been restructured to emphasize collaborative decision-making, crew resource management, and the importance of treating all passengers and crew members with respect, regardless of their position in the aircraft's social hierarchy, or their ability to pay for premium accommodations that separated them physically but not morally from other travelers. The cultural transformation that had occurred throughout Celestial Airways was visible in every aspect of the operation, from the ground crew who loaded luggage with pride in their work and knowledge that their contributions were valued and respected, to the gate agents who assisted passengers with professionalism and courtesy that reflected their understanding that excellent customer service was a source of competitive advantage rather than an expensive luxury that reduced profitability. Most significantly, the company's financial performance had improved dramatically under Amara's ownership, as passengers responded positively to the airline's reputation for treating everyone with dignity and providing consistently excellent service that was not dependent on social status, race, gender, or other characteristics that had previously influenced the quality of treatment that different travelers received during their flights. The employee satisfaction surveys that Amara had implemented revealed that crew members who felt respected and supported by management were more engaged, more productive, and more committed to providing exceptional service to passengers, creating a positive feedback loop that benefited everyone involved in the airline's operations, while generating the kind of customer loyalty and positive word-of-mouth marketing that could not be purchased through traditional advertising campaigns. Mr. Williams, the elderly gentleman who had shared his sandwich with Amara during her forced exile to economy class, had received a lifetime membership in Celestial Airways' premium frequent flyer program, guaranteeing him access to first-class accommodations for the rest of his life, as recognition of the kindness and humanity he had shown during a moment when compassion was more valuable than wealth or social status. His presence in the Diamond-class cabin during subsequent flights served as a reminder to other passengers and crew members that true class was defined by character rather than money, and that the airline's commitment to treating people with dignity extended beyond policy statements to concrete actions that recognized and rewarded the qualities that made commercial aviation a service industry rather than simply a transportation business. The investigation into Crawford's conduct had resulted in his permanent removal from the aviation industry, as federal regulators had determined that his discrimination against passengers and failure to protect crew members represented a pattern of behavior that made him unsuitable for positions of authority and responsibility within commercial aviation, where public safety depended on the competence and integrity of pilots who were entrusted with the lives of hundreds of passengers during every flight they operated. Preston Vale had been convicted of assault against airline crew members and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by community service that would require him to work with organizations that provided services to airline employees and their families, ensuring that his punishment included education about the humanity and dignity of service workers whose contributions to the aviation industry were essential but often undervalued and underappreciated. 12 months after the incident that had transformed both her life and the airline industry's approach to passenger discrimination, Dr. Amara Johnson sat in seat 42B during Celestial Airways Flight 3247 from JFK to London Heathrow, her choice to occupy the same economy seat where she had been exiled, reflecting her commitment to staying connected to the experiences of ordinary passengers rather than isolating herself in the luxury accommodations that her wealth and position could easily provide. The aircraft was the same Boeing 777-300ER that had been the scene of Crawford's discrimination and Preston's assault. But every aspect of the flight experience had been transformed under Amara's ownership, and the cultural changes that had rippled throughout the organization as employees understood that their new leadership valued competence, character, and commitment to service excellence over the political connections and social prejudices that had previously influenced promotion and policy decisions. Maya Rodriguez moved through the cabin with the confidence of someone whose professional expertise was respected and supported by management. Her interactions with passengers reflecting the training that emphasized dignity and respect for everyone aboard the aircraft, regardless of their seat assignment or ticket price, and her authority to enforce safety regulations was backed by policies that protected crew members from retaliation when they reported discrimination or refused to tolerate abusive behavior. Captain David Chen's pre-flight announcement reflected the calm competence that had made him an excellent choice for promotion to senior leadership, and his management of the aircraft and crew demonstrated the collaborative approach that had replaced the authoritarian style that Crawford had used to intimidate employees and passengers who had dared to question his judgment or challenge his decisions. The passenger manifest for the flight included travelers from diverse economic and social backgrounds, reflecting Celestial Airways' reputation as an airline that provided excellent service to everyone, rather than reserving its best treatment for wealthy customers, while subjecting other passengers to inferior accommodations and disrespectful treatment that had previously characterized the industry's approach to class-based service differentiation. In the Diamond-class cabin, the atmosphere was one of relaxed luxury, rather than the tense hierarchy that had existed when Crawford's prejudices and Preston's entitlement had created conflict and division among passengers who should have been able to enjoy their travel experience without witnessing or participating in discrimination that reflected the worst aspects of American social inequality. The seat that had once been occupied by Preston was now filled by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a pediatric surgeon who was traveling to London to present her research on childhood cancer treatment at an international medical conference. Her presence in the premium cabin, reflecting the kind of merit-based access that Amara believed should characterize luxury accommodations, rather than the inherited privilege and political connections that had previously determined who deserved first-class treatment. Mr. Williams occupied seat 1A. The chairman's seat, where Amara had originally been seated before Crawford's discrimination had forced her into economy, and his obvious enjoyment of the champagne service and gourmet cuisine served as a daily reminder to crew members and passengers that dignity and respect were more important than wealth or social status when determining who deserved to be treated as a valued customer. The flight proceeded without incident, the routine nature of the journey reflecting the systematic changes that had eliminated the conflicts and tensions that had previously characterized interactions between crew members and passengers who brought different expectations and prejudices to their shared experience of commercial aviation. As the aircraft crossed the Atlantic Ocean, Amara worked on her laptop, reviewing reports about the expansion of Celestial Airways service to new destinations and the development of partnerships with other airlines that shared her commitment to treating passengers and employees with dignity, regardless of their race, gender, economic status, or other characteristics that had historically influenced the quality of service they received. The financial success that had followed from the cultural transformation was evident in every metric that mattered to airline executives and shareholders, from passenger satisfaction scores that had reached industry-leading levels to employee retention rates that had eliminated the costly turnover and training expenses that had previously reduced profitability and service quality. Through the window beside seat 42, Amara could see the lights of London growing brighter as the aircraft began its descent toward Heathrow Airport, and she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the discrimination and humiliation she had experienced in this same seat to the position of leadership that had enabled her to create systematic change that would benefit countless passengers and employees for years to come. The landing was smooth and professional, reflecting the competence that characterized all aspects of the airline's operations under leadership that valued technical excellence and safety over the personal prejudices and political considerations that had previously influenced decision-making and created unnecessary risks for everyone involved in commercial aviation. As passengers disembarked, many of them thanked the crew members who had provided excellent service throughout the flight, their expressions of appreciation reflecting the positive atmosphere that had replaced the tension and hierarchy that had once made air travel an unpleasant experience for passengers and crew members who were subjected to discrimination and abuse that was tolerated as an acceptable cost of serving wealthy customers. Crawford was nowhere to be seen at Heathrow Airport, his career in aviation having ended with the investigation that had revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior and safety violations that made him unsuitable for positions of responsibility within an industry where public safety depended on the integrity and competence of pilots who were entrusted with the lives of passengers who deserved protection from the personal prejudices and professional failures of crew members who put their own biases ahead of their duty to serve everyone equally. The transformation of Celestial Airways had created a model for other airlines that were beginning to understand that excellent customer service and financial success were compatible with treating employees and passengers with dignity, respect, and the kind of professional competence that made commercial aviation both safe and pleasant for everyone involved in the complex system of transportation that connected people across continents and cultures, while providing opportunities for human connection and understanding that transcended the social barriers that had historically divided people based on wealth, race, and political influence. 2 years after the incident that had reshaped not only Celestial Airways but the entire aviation industry's approach to passenger discrimination and crew protection, Dr. Amara Johnson stood before the International Air Transport Association's annual conference in Geneva, delivering a keynote address about the business case for dignity, respect, and equality in commercial aviation that had attracted airline executives, government regulators, and civil rights advocates from around the world. Her presentation included financial data that demonstrated how the cultural transformation at Celestial Airways had produced measurable improvements in every aspect of the airline's performance, from customer satisfaction scores that consistently ranked among the highest in the industry to employee retention rates that had eliminated the costly turnover and training expenses that had previously reduced profitability while compromising service quality and operational efficiency. When we treat every passenger with dignity, regardless of their appearance, background, or ticket price. Amara told the audience of industry leaders who had gathered to learn from Celestial Airways' success. We create an environment where excellent service becomes the natural result of employees who feel respected and supported, rather than intimidated and demoralized by management policies that prioritize the comfort of wealthy customers over the safety and dignity of the workers who make commercial aviation possible. The ripple effects of Celestial Airways' transformation had spread throughout the aviation industry, as other airlines recognized that discrimination and abuse were not only morally wrong, but also financially counterproductive, creating negative publicity, legal liability, and employee turnover that damaged brand reputation, while increasing operational costs in ways that made companies less competitive in markets where customers had choices about which carriers to patronize. Maya Rodriguez had become a sought-after trainer and consultant whose expertise in crew management and passenger service was valued by airlines that wanted to implement similar cultural changes, and her presentations at industry conferences emphasized the importance of supporting frontline employees who were responsible for implementing policies that reflected corporate values rather than personal prejudices or outdated assumptions about social hierarchy. Captain David Chen had been promoted to Vice President of Flight Operations, making him one of the youngest executives in the airline industry and reflecting Amara's commitment to advancing leaders who demonstrated competence, integrity, and the ability to create positive working environments where technical excellence and human dignity were equally valued and consistently maintained. The Federal Aviation Administration had incorporated lessons from the Celestial Airways incident into its crew training requirements, mandating that all airline personnel receive annual education about discrimination prevention, passenger rights, and the legal obligations that governed interactions between crew members and travelers regardless of their economic status, political connections, or other characteristics that had historically influenced the quality of treatment they received during commercial flights. James Crawford had found employment as a shuttle bus driver at a regional airport, his career in aviation having ended permanently when federal investigators determined that his pattern of discriminatory behavior represented a fundamental incompatibility with the safety responsibilities and professional standards that were required of commercial pilots who were entrusted with public safety and the welfare of passengers who depended on crew competence rather than personal prejudices. His daily routine included watching aircraft take off and land while transporting passengers between remote parking areas and terminal buildings, providing him with constant reminders of the career and authority he had lost through decisions that had prioritized his personal biases over his professional obligations to treat all passengers with equal respect and dignity. Preston Vale had completed his federal prison sentence and community service requirements, his conviction for assault against airline crew members serving as a permanent reminder of the consequences that followed when wealth and political connections failed to protect individuals from accountability for criminal behavior that harmed working people whose safety and dignity were protected by laws that applied equally to everyone regardless of their family background or social status. Mr. Williams had become a frequent traveler whose presence in first-class cabins served as a living symbol of Celestial Airways' commitment to treating passengers based on their character rather than their appearance or economic status, and his interactions with crew members and fellow passengers consistently demonstrated the kind of kindness and humanity that made commercial aviation a service industry rather than simply a transportation business. The broader impact of the Celestial Airways transformation extended beyond the aviation industry to other service sectors where companies began to recognize that treating employees and customers with dignity was not only morally correct, but also financially beneficial. creating positive work environments that attracted talented personnel while generating customer loyalty and positive reputation that could not be purchased through traditional marketing and advertising campaigns. As Amara concluded her presentation to the international audience of airline executives and regulators, she reflected on her grandmother's words about dignity being something carried inside oneself, regardless of how the world chose to respond. And she understood that the changes implemented at Celestial Airways had honored that memory while creating a legacy that would benefit countless passengers and employees who would never experience the discrimination and abuse that had once been tolerated as acceptable costs of serving wealthy customers in industries where profit had been prioritized over human dignity. The standing ovation that followed her presentation reflected the aviation industry's recognition that the transformation of Celestial Airways had demonstrated the possibility of combining financial success with moral leadership, creating a model for corporate governance that proved businesses could thrive, while treating all stakeholders with the respect and dignity that reflected the best values of democratic societies rather than the worst prejudices that had historically divided people based on characteristics that had nothing to do with their worth as human beings. In the years that followed, commercial aviation would never be the same as passengers and crew members came to expect the kind of respectful treatment that had once been available only to wealthy travelers, and airlines discovered that excellence in service was achievable only when everyone involved in the complex system of commercial flight was treated with the dignity that made their contributions possible and their experiences positive, regardless of their position in the social hierarchy that had once governed interactions in the confined spaces where humanity's diversity was most visible and most in need of recognition and celebration. Thank you for watching this powerful story of courage, dignity, and justice that demonstrates how one person's refusal to accept discrimination can transform entire industries and create lasting change that benefits everyone involved. If this story opened your eyes to the reality that respect and dignity should never be determined by appearance or social status, please hit that like button to help us reach more people with this important message about the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things to make the world more fair. And just because your subscription helps us continue sharing these crucial narratives that remind us all about the importance of treating every human being with the dignity they deserve, regardless of their background, appearance, or economic circumstances. Share this video with your family, friends, and community, because these stories about the consequences of prejudice and the rewards of justice need to reach as many people as possible. And together, we can build a world where everyone understands that true authority comes from character rather than position, and real power is exercised to protect the vulnerable rather than to maintain systems that benefit only those who are already privileged. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when you witnessed or experienced discrimination, or when you saw someone stand up for what was right, when others remained silent, because your stories matter, and your voice contributes to the larger conversation about how we can create a society where dignity, respect, and justice are available to everyone rather than luxuries that only some people can afford.